A big thanks to Squarespace for sponsoring this week's video.
Morning everybody, fantastic to see you all again back in my studio. I've missed this. So I wanted to talk today about the thing that I think most landscape photographers misunderstand, I would say, and that is ISO when it comes to exposure with your camera. First, let me just tell you a story. So the other week I was doing a workshop in a woodland and I asked all the workshop attendees what ISO they were shooting, and everybody gave me a different answer, from ISO 64 to ISO 1600. And in that scenario there, taking this shot, there was only really one ISO that you probably should use. And I'll tell you at the end of the video what that is. See if you can guess what it is, but I'll tell you what it is at the end of the video. But I want to say that there is no wrong answer in any of this. This is my opinion, and probably the opinion of lots of other photographers, but you know, the most important thing is getting the shot. For instance, which of these two shots do you like the most? Obviously, it's the bottom one. You know, that is the one that's the best, but that's the one that's taken at ISO 1600. The other one is taken at ISO 64. Again, with these two, which do you think's better? Composition, light, subject is more important than ISO. So just always remember that. I remember when I went to see my friend Morten Hilmer in Denmark, I walked into his house and he had this amazing shot of this polar bear on the wall. And I was just astounded by it. And he told me that it was shot cropped in on something like a 12 megapixel camera at something like ISO 6400. All those things though just didn't matter because it's the shot that counts. So in this video I want to share some examples, more important than anything else. I want to show you when it is good to use high ISO and when it is good to use low ISO. And I also want to just sort of go over some of the myths around ISO in landscape photography. Right, let's get on to the basics. Okay, the basics of exposure. Everyone should know that we've got an exposure triangle, and on that exposure triangle we have ISO, aperture and shutter speed. They're the three things that control the exposure of your image. You can increase them, decrease them, and basically what you're trying to do is get the correct exposure. Two of them give you creative control, so aperture and shutter speed. You may want to open up the aperture, have a bigger aperture, which gives you less depth of field, but lets in more light. And when you do that, you're gonna have to reduce your exposure. Or you may want to have a really small aperture, especially in landscape photography, where you get more depth of field, and then you're gonna have to have a longer exposure. And usually with those, you settle on an exposure and an aperture that you think is going to be right for the scene. For example, in this shot at Corfe Castle, I wanted to create bokeh in the foreground, so I put the aperture at f2.8 on my camera. And then I set the exposure to something that I could handhold, because I was handholding my camera, and then I actually had it on auto ISO, and it gave me this ISO. So in this shot of the waves, I just wanted to control the shutter speed, and half a second happened to be right. So shutter speed and aperture will give you creative control. So when you've set that shutter speed and aperture, sometimes you just don't have enough light into your camera, and light in your camera, as I'll talk about in a minute, is so important. It's more important than anything else because you want to get as much light into your camera as you can for that particular shot that you're taking. Sometimes you don't have enough light, and then that is when you want to increase the ISO to move the exposure to the correct exposure. So in this case of the puffin, I wanted to move the ISO up to ISO 2000 to get the correct exposure. So what is ISO? Well, ISO basically is effectively digital gain. So there's going to be so many people in the comments saying it's not digital gain or whatever. This is going to be the most scientific approach to this. I just want to make it as simple as possible for people that maybe just don't understand exactly what's going on. So ISO is just digitally gain. It just amplifies the signal is the best way to look at it. And so when you don't have as much light coming to your sensor, you can have an amplified signal to give you the correct exposure. But increasing this, amplifying it, reduces the overall quality of the image. And when I say quality, I mean noise and dynamic range. So less light means less information. Basically, ISO is digital gain, and you've all had stereos where you've turned up the gain on a stereo, the volume on a stereo, and you get more noise as you turn that up. So before I get onto some examples, which are the best way of looking at ISO, then I just want to thank this week's sponsor, and that is Squarespace. Making a website was probably the best thing that I ever did for my photography and for my business. It's in your control. You can control how your photos look, you can control the layout of them, and you can write things like blogs, you can update your homepage really easily. Also, you can add an e-commerce store if you want to. It's super simple to do and you don't have to have any technical skills. So if you're looking to build your own website, then please check out Squarespace. I talk about it a lot, but honestly, it's the best platform for showcasing your photography. There's a link in the description to get 10% off, or you can use squarespace.com/Nigel for 10% also. Okay, so let's have a look at some examples. So this is a photo that I took in Iceland. And I took it on 2 different shutter speeds. The exposure is the same, so the ultimate resulting image is the same, but there's 2 different shutter speeds. And to do that, I had to increase the ISO when I was shooting faster to get the water stationary. But you can see when I increase the exposure of this afterwards in Lightroom, you can see that there's a lot more noise in the higher ISO image. So with a higher ISO image, you get more noise and you get less dynamic range. And actually the less dynamic range is probably the more important thing. And something that a lot of people don't think about. So, you know, you've got to think about those 2 things. So there's always this trade-off between shutter speed and ISO. Do you want to get the correct exposure by having a longer exposure? Or do you want to get the correct exposure by having a shorter exposure, but increasing the ISO and then having a trade-off with noise? Well, both are right. There's no wrong answer here, and I want to go through a few examples because going through lots of examples I think is the best way to explain why this is. Maybe you're hand holding it, maybe you got it on a tripod, maybe there's water, maybe there's not, maybe there's birds, etc. Right, so let's go for this first one. Have a guess, what do you think the ISO of this is? So it's ISO 64, and this is the same as when we were shooting in the woodland, when I was on that workshop right at the beginning, and when I spoke about everybody having different ISOs. The correct ISO for something like this is ISO 64. There is no movement. On this morning, it was around 4 a.m., beautiful summer morning actually, when I took this shot of Enchanted Oaks, and there was no wind whatsoever. So that meant that I could have a really long exposure to get as much light as I could onto the sensor, and that would give me less noise and more dynamic range. And in this particular shot, that was really important. So I shot ISO 64, and actually was a 10-second exposure at f9 to get the depth of field. So ISO 64 was the right there. It would be really stupid to go to ISO 400, 800, 1600 and have a faster shutter speed because I had it on my tripod and there was no wind, so there was no reason not to have a long exposure. On this shot here though, of the aurora, this was in Scotland when I was on the Isle of Harris doing my Luscantire project. It was really amazing. We had the Northern Lights, which we've had a lot this year, and on this one, I wanted quite a fast shutter speed because it was dancing around the Northern Lights and I wanted a 2-second shutter speed. This was an f1.8 lens I had on, 24mm lens. And so I had to up the ISO to ISO 3200, which is what I needed to get the correct exposure. With this one here, I should have upped the ISO even higher, I think. But in the end, I think it works. I shot it at 6 seconds, this aurora, and it sort of blurs a little bit, but I like the way that that curve matches up with the snow at the bottom, so that blur's not that important. So I shot this at ISO 2000, but I needed to have 6 seconds to get the right exposure. I could have, and maybe I should have done, and I didn't take a shot like this, but I should have gone up to maybe ISO 6400 and done a much faster shutter speed, because that probably would have created something with a little bit more detail in the aurora. Again, if you're a wildlife photographer, then obviously increasing the ISO can be really important because quite often you want a really fast shutter speed. And this was again in Iceland, and I was shooting these puffins and it was dusk and I wanted to get a puffin in silhouette in flight. I wanted it to be pin sharp, so I needed a shutter speed of 1/3000th of a second. I could shoot at f4, I was shooting at 100mm, tracking these puffins. They were an absolute nightmare to shoot. I'll link a video here of me trying to shoot them, it's quite funny. But I had to shoot ISO 4000 here. But it's better to get this shot than this shot of this puffin just blurry. The most important thing in this was having a really fast shutter speed, so then I could actually compromise the ISO. And then one final example is this one here. Again in Iceland, this was actually with Rick, we were trying to get a shot of this Range Rover actually in the rain. I jumped out, was throwing it down in rain. I wanted to have some rain streaks in front. So the most important thing for that was about a 60th of a second. I'd experimented with a few different shutter speeds. So I had it on auto ISO, and I'll come back to that in a minute. I had it on auto ISO, I set the shutter speed, I set the aperture, and then just didn't worry too much about the ISO because I just wanted to get creative control over those raindrops and that streaking of those raindrops, which was so important to me. Right, let's get on to some common myths, mistakes that people make. And I've made these mistakes as well. And that's never shoot landscapes at high ISO. Well, I think I've just explained that to you, but that depends, I think. If you've got something like a Z8, then obviously you can shoot at a higher ISO than if you've got a really 10-year-old camera, because the technology has improved greatly. Sensors are a lot better, the gain in sensors is a lot better, and you can shoot at higher ISOs without a lot of detrimental quality. But you know, if we compare this, the D300 to the Z7, I took the same shot here. This was on a video when I was in Scotland. I'll link it here. And you can see that there's a massive difference between these two cameras at the same ISO. So it depends, and I think for your camera, you've got to take a number of shots and work out how that noise changes as you're increasing your ISO. But you should, it's just rubbish that you should never shoot at high ISO. All the time I shoot at high ISO, and there's two examples here. This was shot at ISO 2500. And that was done because I was hand holding it. I was walking away from the volcano. I turned around, I had my camera with me, and I just wanted to take this shot. I didn't want to get my tripod out. I was knackered. You know, we'd done a 22-kilometer walk to and back from the volcano. This was on the way back. So I set it at a 13th of a second, which I felt I could hand hold, and that resulted in an ISO of ISO 2500. I wouldn't have got this shot if I had gone to ISO 64. So it was so important to get the shot. It was way more important than worrying about the ISO. Nobody looks at this shot and goes, well, that was shot at high ISO. Just doesn't matter. Same with this shot. I was on a Zodiac, it was bumpy. I needed a shutter speed, I reckon, of a 1/600th of a second, because otherwise it was just so much movement. It was really difficult, and I wanted a lot of depth of field, so I needed f14, so that was really important to me. So I ended up having ISO 1800 with this, which just seems random for a shot like this. It seems really bright, and it was. There was quite a lot of light, but at f14 and 1/600th of a second, then I needed to shoot at a higher ISO to get this shot. And I'm pleased I did, because I think it's really good. The next thing I hear all the time is you can just brighten up an image as it does the same as ISO. And that is true and not true, to be honest. There's something called ISO invariant. I'm not going to go into it. I'll put a link in the description below to a thing on DP Review, a really good article on DP Review by a guy there, the editor, called Richard. He's very knowledgeable about this, and he's done a brilliant article about ISO invariance. Invariance basically means that exactly that you can brighten up the image and it give you the same result as taking that shot at a higher ISO. So you could take it ISO 400, ISO 1600, brighten up the ISO 400 one because it'll be darker, and then you get the same result. Most cameras now are ISO invariant at certain ISOs. So for instance, the Z8 is ISO invariant at ISO 500 and above. Yeah, so if you're shooting ISO 500 or ISO 3200, you'll get the same result just by brightening up the image afterwards. I don't bother with that though, because it is the same result. I like to see the result on the back of my camera, so I still just put it on auto ISO if I need to. It's super useful, auto ISO. I quite often use it if I want to set the shutter speed. I know that, say I'm shooting birds is a good example, and I want to set it at 2,000th of a second. And I also know that I'm going to be shooting at f4. So I set f4, 2,000th of a second. Then I don't want to worry too much about the exposure, so I just set it at auto ISO. But you can set limits on most cameras. So I set an upper limit to my auto ISO. So you might want to say, don't shoot more than ISO 1600, for instance. But don't always use auto ISO. You know, if you're in a position where you're on a tripod, there's no movement, then you want to let in as much light as you can to get the correct exposure, not increase the ISO. That's super important. So woodland, where there's no movement, you know, most landscapes, there's not going to be a huge amount of movement in. So, you know, getting the exposure by having a longer shutter speed is way better way of getting a good quality image in terms of noise and dynamic range than increasing the ISO. You want to shoot at the base ISO if possible. Okay, let's have a look at a trick. You've got an image, you've got a lot of noise in your image. What can you do with Lightroom? Well, as you can see here, in Lightroom, what you can do is you can go to denoise. It's a new AI feature in Lightroom and it is incredible. So here I'm denoising this Z3300 image, which was so noisy. And you can see here the before and after of this is just incredible. But I use it all the time for images. So these are the Svalbard pictures I took and I've denoised these as well. It's a really good way of getting rid of noise, but you do sacrifice a little bit of sharpness, and also it doesn't bring back that dynamic range. So you may be able to reduce some of the noise, but you're never going to get back that dynamic range. But it is a really good tool. I definitely have a look at it. And the best thing is you don't have to go into Photoshop or anything. You can just do it all in Lightroom now with the denoise feature. That's it really. I hope you've found this useful. So for anybody interested in my camper van, then I have been working really hard on it over the last few weeks, but I had a bit of a setback because I really hurt my back. I was meant to be doing a sort of golf tournament with Nikon at the Open course in Scotland. I went to the driving range because I'd not hit a golf ball since my back operation, swung a golf club 4 times, and really badly hurt my back. To the point where I've been getting massive headaches because I think I've increased the CSF leak in my back. So I've tried to do as much camper van as I can. I've got lots of video that I've got to edit now and produce some videos and put them out there. So there will be one in the next few weeks, I'm not sure when. But I'm going to be producing videos, I've decided, every other Sunday now. So there won't be a video next Sunday, but the Sunday after that, there will be a video. And I think that video is probably going to be from the northeast of England, believe it or not. I've not been there for a while. Thanks ever so much for watching. And until next but one Sunday, bye.